They had braced themselves for the worst: shame, starvation, maybe even death. It was what their commanders had drilled into them with relentless certainty. Surrender to the Americans was the ultimate disgrace, an act beyond forgiveness, and capture would mean a descent into cruelty without end. Stories had filtered back from the front, always grim, always emphasizing the unyielding brutality that awaited those who fell into enemy hands. So when these Japanese soldiers, exhausted, wounded, and hollow-eyed from months or even years of desperate fighting, were finally herded onto the transport ships bound for the United States, most believed their lives as they'd known them were finished. Whatever future lay ahead, it would be a shadow of existence, stripped of honor, comfort, and dignity. But the moment they set foot on American soil, everything began to unravel in unexpected ways. Instead of blows and jeering, they encountered a methodical process. They were registered, counted, their details recorded with mechanical efficiency. There were no taunts, no random humiliations. Long lines shuffled forward toward sprawling compounds, their outer fences bristling with barbed wire, but the interiors revealing neat rows of barracks, not the dark, cramped cells they had imagined. American guards kept their weapons in plain sight and maintained a respectful distance, but there was an absence of violence, of arbitrary punishments. The whole atmosphere was strangely calm, almost courteous, though the courtesy was impersonal and matter-of-fact. Then there was the food, a revelation in itself. Instead of the thin gruel or contaminated water they had come to expect, they received full rations, steaming trays of rice and vegetables, thick slices of bread glazed with butter, coffee, strong and hot, and on occasion, actual meat. The irony was impossible to ignore. Here in the hands of their adversaries, they were being fed better than they had been by their own army in the field. For many, it was the first hot meal in months. It defied everything they'd been told. Weren't prisoners supposed to be broken through deprivation? Yet the Americans adhered to the Geneva Convention with a sense of duty, as if each decent act was a message, an extension of psychological warfare, a subtle demonstration of American values. Even the smallest kindnesses, an extra helping of bread, a wordless gesture toward the water tap, became quietly disorienting. Inside the camps, the strangeness deepened. There were, of course, the telltale signs of imprisonment: fences, towers, barbed wire. But inside the perimeter, the environment was almost orderly, even institutional. Long wooden barracks provided shelter from the elements. Kitchens turned out meals with clockwork regularity, and there were places set aside for work and study. Some compounds even boasted libraries stocked with English books and magazines, a bewildering luxury. Sports fields appeared too, baseball diamonds and soccer pitches laid out for anyone who wanted distraction from the monotony. For men who had weathered the misery of jungle warfare, disease, hunger, rain that never stopped, the constant threat of violence, this new world felt almost surreal. The chaos, filth, and unpredictability of battle were replaced by a kind of antiseptic order that was both comforting and unsettling. Most prisoners arrived in poor condition, malnourished, sick, their wounds only partially healed. American medics examined them briskly, noting fevers, infections, and infestations. To be tended to by the enemy was, for many, an emotional jolt. Some viewed the care with suspicion, convinced it was some form of trickery or interrogation in disguise. Others, too tired to resist, simply submitted, stunned that their well-being seemed to matter to anyone at all. What threw them most wasn't any overt act of cruelty, but the cold, efficient kindness that permeated the place. They were cared for, yes, but it was care stripped of personal warmth, an institutional benevolence that was a far cry from the camaraderie of their own ranks, yet undeniably real. Perhaps most baffling of all was the sheer organization of camp life. Every detail, from meal times to medical checks, was governed by a schedule. The camps ran like well-oiled machines, with procedures for everything. For soldiers accustomed to improvisation, patching uniforms with scavenged thread, cutting each other's hair with dull blades, rationing every drop of water, this level of structure bordered on luxury. The scent of soap lingered in the barracks and washrooms, a sensory reminder of a world they'd almost forgotten. It was as if they had been transported from the lawless margins of war into the heart of a functioning society, albeit one bounded by wire. Another shock lay in the way Americans flattened hierarchy. Officers and enlisted men queued together for food, processed side by side, their ranks rendered less relevant than the demands of efficiency. In Japanese military culture, rank defined every interaction, shaping the very fabric of daily life. Here, it was as though the system itself mattered more than individual status. For officers, this subtle erosion of hierarchy was deeply unsettling, a quiet challenge to everything they had been taught about order and authority. It offered a glimpse of a military grounded in rules and routines rather than unquestioning obedience, a difference that gnawed at their sense of identity. Rumors filled the air, spreading from barrack to barrack. Some said barbers would come to cut their hair. Others whispered about tailors distributing uniforms or laundry being collected like in a real town. Initially, these stories sounded like fantasy. Yet, one by one, they proved true. Barbers did arrive, shears in hand. Clean clothes were issued. Laundry was gathered and returned. The realization dawned slowly. America operated on systems and routines that ran deeper than any individual's will, a society where even prisoners were swept up in the machinery of order. The greatest surprise, perhaps, was the sense of being treated as people who still mattered. Camp life was punctuated by rituals, roll calls, hygiene inspections, regular meals, that stood in stark contrast to the lawless desperation of the battlefield. The most jarring moments came when guards handed out instructions for personal hygiene. Every man was required to bathe, shave, and keep himself tidy. For soldiers who had gone months rationing water, the notion of daily washing was almost laughable, yet it was not optional. Lineups formed for inspection, guards checking that every man complied, the discipline as thorough as in any drill. The impact ran deeper than mere discomfort. Japanese military life had conditioned them to endure pain, deprivation, and humiliation. Yet paradoxically, it was this first encounter with structure and impersonal care, even rendered without warmth, that unsettled them most. It challenged the narrative they had been taught about the enemy, about themselves, and about the nature of strength. For many, it was not the fear of punishment or deprivation that lingered, but the uneasy realization that order, even when imposed by the enemy, could be more disorienting than chaos. In its quiet, systematic way, the camp stripped away old certainties and left them questioning where, in this new world of routines and regulations, their place might be. In the Imperial Army, dirt and grime were badges of honor. Nobody expected you to stay clean. If anything, being filthy showed you were tough enough to march through swamps, eat whatever rations you got, and keep moving while your clothes turned to rags on your back. Cleanliness wasn't a virtue. It was a distraction from real sacrifice. So when Japanese soldiers landed in American POW camps and got told to scrub up, cut their nails, and keep their hair in order, it felt like someone had turned their old world upside down. Showers were the first shock. Most camps had big communal shower rooms hooked up to actual hot water systems, a total luxury compared to anything in the field. Prisoners remembered that first blast of steaming water burning away weeks of grime, the sharp bite of American soap, the feel of real towels instead of ragged cloth. Sure, being forced to strip and wash under guard was humiliating at first, but after a while, some men found relief in it, even a bit of lost dignity. Shaving was another strange adjustment. Back home, nobody cared if your beard grew wild in the tropics. If anything, it showed how hard you'd been fighting. Suddenly, the Americans handed out razors, sometimes those safety razors the men had never seen before, and gave instructions on how to use them. Smooth faces became the rule, not the exception. At first it seemed pointless, but then the guards started to notice, even praise, those who kept up appearances. It turned out grooming was just another kind of discipline in the American system. Uniforms told their own story. When they arrived, most Japanese prisoners were in tatters, boots falling apart, shirts ripped to shreds by months of jungle fighting. The Americans took away what was left and handed out simple, sturdy work clothes, marked PW in big letters. At first, wearing them was humiliating, a constant reminder of captivity. But over time, men started to see the upside. These uniforms got washed, mended, even replaced. It was nothing like the old days, where you wore the same threadbare kit until it fell apart. Camp authorities didn't pretend this was about kindness. Disease could tear through crowded barracks in no time, and the Americans were determined to keep it out. Regular lice checks, disinfectant powder on bedding and clothes. If you resisted, they reminded you that this was about keeping everyone alive. Slowly, even the most stubborn men gave in. Routine became part of life, whether they liked it or not. What really threw the prisoners, though, wasn't the soap or the razors. It was the way the Americans seemed to believe that order itself came from these routines. Hygiene wasn't just about health. It was about control, about shaping men without the threat of violence. For soldiers raised to see filth as proof of sacrifice, the idea that their captors saw neatness as strength felt completely alien. Cleanliness, they realized, wasn't a sign of weakness. It was discipline enforced by rules instead of fear. Just when they thought they'd seen it all, the barbershops appeared. Actual barbershops inside the camp, chairs, mirrors, electric clippers buzzing. For men used to hacking at hair with dull knives or just letting it grow wild, it felt surreal. The first visits were tense. They sat stiff and wary, half expecting punishment. But soon they realized it was just another routine. Sometimes American guards cut hair, but often it was fellow prisoners who'd been trained for the job. For many, it was the first time they'd seen their own faces in a mirror since leaving Japan. No more grime, hair trimmed, features they barely recognized after months in the jungle. Hair held meaning in Japanese tradition. A wild mane could show suffering or the length of a campaign. Having it tamed by the enemy felt like another kind of defeat. But after a while, the practical side won out. Short hair meant fewer lice, less itching, a lighter head in the heat. The Americans pointed this out too. Good grooming kept disease down and made camp life run smoother. In the end, order wasn't just enforced. It started to make a strange kind of sense. Barbershops quickly became the unofficial centers of camp life, humming with more than the steady drone of clippers. These makeshift salons were where men drifted to escape monotony, forming a quiet social core that pulsed with low-voiced conversation and the subtle tension of friendly rivalry. Soldiers would huddle close, murmuring the latest camp rumors, debating news from the outside, or discreetly judging who had managed to get the sharpest fade that week. There was a kind of silent contest playing out every time someone walked away from the chair, an unspoken awareness of the irony. They were prisoners of war, yet still found ways to care about who looked the most squared away. Years later, when many former POWs tried to capture their experiences on paper, they found themselves returning to these moments in the barber shop. One man recalled the strange comfort of sitting beneath the buzzing blades, the sound of a distant baseball game filtering in through an open window, and the surreal sense that camp life beat to its own peculiar rhythm, completely disconnected from the violence and disorder raging just beyond the wire. In a world defined by chaos, the order and routine of the barber shop offered a sliver of normalcy, a reminder of the way things once were and perhaps might be again. For American military officials, the barber shop was about much more than personal hygiene. Military discipline, they believed, began with appearance. A fresh haircut was a visible marker of order and control, a way to keep spirits in check and prevent rebellion from brewing in the ranks. There was a practical logic to it, too. When everyone sported the same neat trim, it was harder for troublemakers to stand out or for unrest to spread. Uniformity made management easier for guards, who could scan a sea of identical heads and quickly spot anything out of place. The Army also understood the importance of appearances when outsiders came to inspect the camps. Whenever the Red Cross paid a visit, officials could point proudly to rows of clean-shaven faces and polished boots, tangible proof that the Geneva Convention standards were being upheld. This outward show of discipline was a kind of performance, a signal to both the prisoners and the world beyond the barbed wire that the Americans were running their camps by the book. Yet, for all its utility, the barbershop also brought a strange sense of dislocation. In some camps, Japanese prisoners who had once been barbers in cities like Osaka found themselves asked to pick up scissors and razors again. The transformation was jarring. One day, a man was a soldier on the battlefield. The next, he was cutting the hair of fellow captives as armed guards watched from the corner. And yet, in that simple act of returning to an old trade, some found a fleeting connection to the lives they had been forced to leave behind. The ritual of snipping hair, of wiping down tools and swapping familiar jokes offered a rare moment of comfort, a way to reclaim a small piece of identity, if only for the length of a haircut. For many prisoners, the barbershop's pristine order was as surprising as anything else. Used to the mud-soaked trenches and foxholes of the front lines, where dirt caked every surface and personal grooming was a luxury, they were taken aback by the gleaming floors, spotless mirrors, and the ritual cleaning of combs and scissors after each use. The environment felt almost otherworldly, an island of cleanliness and routine in a landscape otherwise shaped by deprivation and uncertainty. Every trip to the barber was a reminder that, for their captors, discipline and appearance mattered everywhere, not just on parade grounds or in training camps, but even in the smallest, most mundane details of daily life. If the barbershop was a revelation, the tailoring services offered within American camps were even more astonishing. In their own army, uniforms were worn to shreds, patched haphazardly with whatever scraps could be found, and threadbare clothing was a badge of endurance. But inside the camp, guards collected torn or worn-out shirts and trousers and returned them, days later, mended and neatly pressed. At first, prisoners were baffled. Why would their captors bother to repair a prisoner's clothing, instead of letting them shuffle around in rags as a sign of defeat? It seemed to defy logic, running counter to everything they had come to expect from an enemy. But the practice soon revealed itself as part of a larger system. Clothes were assigned, logged, repaired, and distributed with clockwork efficiency, as though the camp were some kind of civilian institution rather than a holding pen for defeated soldiers. The process was about more than just providing something to wear. It was about stripping away the individual and reinforcing a new, enforced equality. Each uniform was stamped with a stark PW on the back, erasing old identities and flattening rank. Officers who once wore ornate insignia now dressed just like the lowest enlisted men. For Japanese prisoners, this loss of status cut particularly deep, as their culture placed great importance on uniforms as symbols of honor and achievement. To the Americans, however, the priority was simple. Everyone should be clean, orderly, and indistinguishable from the next. Yet even in this system, some men managed to find opportunity. Those with backgrounds in tailoring or textile work were assigned to the camp's sewing teams. Suddenly, they had access to electric sewing machines, shelves stocked with thread, and benches bathed in bright light, conditions that rivaled or even surpassed what they had known at home. The whir of the machines and the rhythm of careful stitching brought a sense of purpose, a chance to lose themselves in familiar work and momentarily forget the reality outside the workshop walls. In a place designed to erase individuality, these small routines and skills offered a way to hold on to fragments of their past lives, turning the act of mending a uniform into an act of quiet resilience. In the end, the barber shops and tailoring rooms of these camps were more than just places to tidy up hair or patch a sleeve. They became microcosms of the strange, shifting world of captivity, a world where discipline and conformity were both tools of control and unexpected sources of comfort, where old trades found new meaning, and where the routines of daily life offered a lifeline to the people they once were. For a lot of these men, being captured meant an unexpected return to their old civilian trades. In their memoirs, former prisoners often said that guys picked for tailoring had it a bit better. Warmer indoor jobs, some extra food now and then, and something to do that actually mattered in the camp's daily grind. One thing that really stood out was how clothes got handed out for winter and summer. Unlike the thin, ragged uniforms they'd worn in the islands, here in the American Midwest or South, they got real seasonal gear. Jackets, gloves, heavier pants. Guys who'd nearly lost fingers to frostbite in the past couldn't believe it. Sometimes the Red Cross would chip in with socks, scarves, even bits of fabric to patch up holes. After a while, the prisoners saw their captors weren't just keeping them alive. They were following international rules and doing it by the book. It wasn't just about uniforms. Prisoners made curtains for the barracks, fixed up bedding, and even sewed flags for camp sports. They had the skills and suddenly materials to match. For men used to making do with scraps, this was a shock. Bit by bit, they realized that in America, people didn't just improvise when things ran out. They set up systems so things didn't run out in the first place. To the Japanese, the whole setup seemed almost luxurious, maybe even a little over the top. They couldn't understand why the enemy cared if prisoners had patched clothes, or why so much effort went into these details. But as the months dragged on, those rows of mended uniforms piled up in storage, and it started to hit them. This wasn't about kindness. It was control, organization, and discipline, core parts of American military life. What started as confusion slowly grew into a grudging respect. Tailoring wasn't a favor. It was another way the captors ran a tight ship. Laundry was another eye-opener. In the Japanese army, washing uniforms was an afterthought, if it happened at all. Men would scrub their clothes in rivers or just let grime build up until they literally fell apart. Out on the islands, some wore the same set of rags for months. The smell stuck to everything. So when these prisoners stepped into a camp where laundry was collected, washed, and handed back on schedule, it blew their minds. Laundry days ran like clockwork. Bags marked with prisoner numbers got picked up, sometimes by truck, and sent to central laundries. Inside, steam-powered machines churned away, filling the air with hot, soapy smells. Prisoners who'd never seen machines like this just stared. Clothes went in filthy and came out clean, all at once, with a noise and speed that felt almost unreal. Clean bedsheets added to the shock. Back home or on campaign, many had slept on dirt or straw crawling with bugs. Now sheets and blankets were washed and swapped out regularly. Some prisoners wrote later that the crisp, clean bedding made it hard to sleep at first. They just weren't used to being so clean or comfortable. But what really stuck with them was the routine. Guards expected everything on time. Laundry had to be folded just so, marked with the right number. If you got it wrong, you waited longer for clean clothes. For Americans, this was just military order as usual. For Japanese prisoners, it was a lesson in what systems could do, how you could plan, track, and run every detail without chaos. The laundry wasn't just a service either. It became a workplace. Prisoners assigned there learned to use big industrial presses, irons, sorting tables. Men who used to march through jungles now spent days folding uniforms, watched by supervisors. Some even took quiet pride in learning these new machines, as if mastering a strange new trade. These jobs came with small perks: indoor work, shelter from bad weather, sometimes a chance to chat with Red Cross inspectors checking up on things. The Red Cross, in fact, helped keep these standards high. Inspection reports didn't merely record that the barracks were tidy. They detailed the systematic routines that governed camp life. Laundry services ran on a schedule, bedding was exchanged regularly, and every aspect of cleanliness was monitored and enforced. The thoroughness of these reports didn't stay secret for long. News of the American camp's attention to hygiene and order spread internationally, drawing notice from neutral observers and critics alike. Soon, these camps were being cited as models of Geneva Convention compliance, a point of pride, but also a strategic message. America wanted the world to see that it upheld humane standards, even toward its enemies. For the Japanese prisoners, these routines quickly became more than just a curiosity. They were a revelation. Many arrived bracing themselves for squalor, expecting to be neglected, even starved or abused, based on what they had heard or experienced in captivity elsewhere. The reality, the steady distribution of clean clothes, the enforced routines of hygiene, felt almost surreal. It was not just a matter of comfort. It was proof that their captors operated within a system, one that seemed to value order, discipline, and a certain baseline of human dignity. This realization, subtle at first, grew with each passing week. The true shock set in when prisoners compared these conditions to their memories of the war. The contrast was stark. The image of a pristine laundry room, full of steam and the sound of machines, clashed violently with the scenes etched into their minds. Soldiers crouched in muddy fields, scraping lice from their bodies, wringing out shirts so infested with mold they gave off a permanent stench. The idea that cleanliness could be routine, that it could be enforced by authority rather than struggled for individually, upended much of what they had come to expect from captivity, and perhaps from life itself. At first, suspicion and resistance were common. Many prisoners arrived with a deep sense of humiliation, convinced that their capture had shamed their families and disgraced the emperor. Some saw the camp's routines, mandatory showers, regular shaves, compulsory haircuts, as further insults, a stripping away of autonomy. A few refused to bathe, others skipped the barber shop, or tried to avoid the orderlies distributing fresh clothing. But the system was persistent. Guards and supervisors ensured compliance, sometimes sternly, and gradually resistance gave way to habit. With time, something unexpected happened. The routines that had once seemed like punishments became a source of comfort. The simple acts, washing, shaving, donning a clean shirt, sleeping on bedding that didn't reek of decay, began to restore a sense of self. For men who had been reduced to numbers, forced to march and fight until their bodies broke down, these small reminders of normalcy became lifelines. Seeing one's own reflection in a mirror after months of filth and exhaustion was jarring, but it also rekindled memories of home, of life before defeat. For many, it was the first step to reclaiming their humanity after the trauma of battle and capture. These changes didn't go unnoticed by the guards either. American officers observed that as hygiene improved, so did discipline and morale. Fewer lice meant fewer outbreaks of disease. Fresher clothing led to less bickering and irritability. The atmosphere in the barracks became less volatile, and the threat of violence or rebellion diminished. Cleanliness, it turned out, wasn't just about appearances. It was a tool for maintaining order and stability. The transformation extended beyond the individual. As more prisoners embraced the routines, the collective mood shifted. The shared experience of cleanliness and order fostered a strange sense of community, a bond that transcended language and background. Men who had once seen themselves only as defeated soldiers now found themselves part of a new, if temporary, society, one governed by rules that emphasized care and discipline over suffering and endurance. For many Japanese soldiers, this marked a profound cultural shift. In the army, suffering had been glorified. Hardship was a measure of strength, and comfort was suspected as a sign of weakness. The American approach upended those values. Here, discipline was enforced not through deprivation, but through routines that preserved health and dignity. The realization that the enemy maintained control and morale not through brutality, but through structured care, challenged long-held beliefs about power and resilience. Some prisoners began to wonder if there was strength to be found in compassion and order, not just in hardship. Of course, not everyone was eager to adapt. Some officers warned their men that these comforts threatened to erode the warrior spirit, that too much ease would sap their resolve and loyalty. They reminded the prisoners of their duties, of the shame of capture, and of the need to resist softening under enemy influence. This tension, between the old ideals of stoic suffering and the new routines of enforced care, became part of daily life inside the camp. For some, it created inner conflict. For others, it was a source of quiet rebellion or self-reflection. But the impact of these routines could not be denied. Over time, what began as imposed chores, laundry, shaving, mending, haircuts, transformed into rituals that helped the men survive psychologically as well as physically. The initial shock of enforced cleanliness faded into acceptance, and that acceptance became a subtle form of resistance against despair. Every fresh shirt, every orderly bunk, was a small affirmation that they still mattered as individuals. As months turned into years, many prisoners looked back on these routines as the thread that had carried them through captivity. The structure and predictability offered a sense of stability amid uncertainty. The act of caring for oneself, however minor, became a way to push back against the loss and humiliation of defeat. And while not all wounds were healed, and not every man left unchanged, the lessons of those routines, about dignity, resilience, and the quiet strength found in order, remained long after the gates finally opened. Inside the ordered routines of American camps, Japanese prisoners found something unexpected. Dignity didn't come from battlefield heroics, but from the tiny rituals that shaped each day. Shaving, clean uniforms, a sense of personal care. On the surface, it all looked simple enough. Barbers, tailors, laundry lines humming along. But none of this was accidental or just a gesture of kindness. It was all part of a bigger American plan for handling thousands of enemy soldiers far from home. After the chaos of World War I, when prisoners suffered and unrest broke out, the U.S. studied what went wrong. This time they wanted control, not chaos. So they built a system on rules, schedules, and the Geneva Convention. They believed, and the records show, that when people felt human, clean, well-fed, treated with at least a shred of respect, they were easier to manage. Desperate, filthy men get desperate ideas. But men with a routine? They're less likely to rebel. Barbershops, laundry rooms, and tailoring weren't just about keeping up appearances. They kept prisoners busy, distracted, and invested in the day-to-day. Schedules, inspections, the small pride of a pressed shirt. These things kept their minds off escape or revolt. There was another angle, too. The world was always watching. The International Red Cross dropped in often, taking notes, talking to prisoners, filing reports. The U.S. used this. They wanted to show, especially to anyone listening overseas, that their enemies weren't starving or beaten down. Clean uniforms and good treatment pushed back against stories of American cruelty. It wasn't just for the enemy's benefit either. Americans back home needed to believe they were still the good guys, even in war. And honestly, it was also about showing off. The U.S. Army's supply chains were massive. Keeping millions of their own soldiers fed and clothed was already a huge job. Extending that to enemy prisoners? That took resources, sure, but it showed the scale of American power. For Japanese prisoners used to shortages and hunger, the abundance was almost shocking, a kind of quiet proof that America could outlast and outsupply anyone. Labor was a big part of the plan. If prisoners were healthy and presentable, they could work. Camps put them in the fields, on lumber details, or to work right there in the laundries and tailor shops. It gave their days rhythm, kept them occupied, and, maybe most importantly, kept them from sitting around with nothing to do but nurse grudges. This thinking even shaped the camps themselves. Buildings were laid out with clear zones for sleeping, working, cleaning, and recreation. Everything had its place, and everyone kept moving. Guards enforced the rules, but the real discipline came from the routine itself. There just wasn't much space left for plotting trouble. To many Japanese prisoners, this whole approach felt strange. They'd grown up expecting a brutal captor, someone who'd break them down. Instead, they found a system built on order, routine, and even a kind of care that doubled as control. What they didn't realize was how deeply this mindset ran in American military tradition. A mix of practicality, legal obligation, and the belief that order wins wars, not just firepower. When the war finally ended and the gates opened, many Japanese prisoners carried home memories that surprised them. In memoirs and quiet conversations, they talked about how something as ordinary as a barber shop or a laundry line had changed the way they saw their captors. They'd pictured ruthless conquerors, but found a country whose strength showed up not just in battle, but in the calm, relentless order of daily life. Decades later, some still remembered the shock of seeing industrial washing machines or professional barbers in action. Small details, but unforgettable all the same. Inside the ordered routines of American camps, Japanese prisoners found something unexpected. Dignity didn't come from battlefield heroics, but from the tiny rituals that shaped each day. Shaving, clean uniforms, a sense of personal care. On the surface, it all looked simple enough. Barbers, tailors, laundry lines humming along. But none of this was accidental or just a gesture of kindness. It was all part of a bigger American plan for handling thousands of enemy soldiers far from home. After the chaos of World War I, when prisoners suffered and unrest broke out, the U.S. studied what went wrong. This time they wanted control, not chaos. So they built a system on rules, schedules, and the Geneva Convention. They believed, and the records show, that when people felt human, clean, well-fed, treated with at least a shred of respect, they were easier to manage. Desperate, filthy men get desperate ideas. But men with a routine? They're less likely to rebel. Barber shops, laundry rooms, and tailoring weren't just about keeping up appearances. They kept prisoners busy, distracted, and invested in the day-to-day. Schedules, inspections, the small pride of a pressed shirt. These things kept their minds off escape or revolt. There was another angle, too. The world was always watching. The International Red Cross dropped in often, taking notes, talking to prisoners, filing reports. The U.S. used this. They wanted to show, especially to anyone listening overseas, that their enemies weren't starving or beaten down. Clean uniforms and good treatment pushed back against stories of American cruelty. It wasn't just for the enemy's benefit either. Americans back home needed to believe they were still the good guys, even in war. And honestly, it was also about showing off. The U.S. Army's supply chains were massive. Keeping millions of their own soldiers fed and clothed was already a huge job. Extending that to enemy prisoners? That took resources, sure, but it showed the scale of American power. For Japanese prisoners used to shortages and hunger, the abundance was almost shocking, a kind of quiet proof that America could outlast and outsupply anyone. Labor was a big part of the plan. If prisoners were healthy and presentable, they could work. Camps put them in the fields, on lumber details, or to work right there in the laundries and tailor shops. It gave their days rhythm, kept them occupied, and, maybe most importantly, kept them from sitting around with nothing to do but nurse grudges. This thinking even shaped the camps themselves. Buildings were laid out with clear zones for sleeping, working, cleaning, and recreation. Everything had its place, and everyone kept moving. Guards enforced the rules, but the real discipline came from the routine itself. There just wasn't much space left for plotting trouble. To many Japanese prisoners, this whole approach felt strange. They'd grown up expecting a brutal captor, someone who'd break them down. Instead, they found a system built on order, routine, and even a kind of care that doubled as control. What they didn't realize was how deeply this mindset ran in American military tradition. A mix of practicality, legal obligation, and the belief that order wins wars, not just firepower. When the war finally ended and the gates opened, many Japanese prisoners carried home memories that surprised them. In memoirs and quiet conversations, they talked about how something as ordinary as a barber shop or a laundry line had changed the way they saw their captors. They'd pictured ruthless conquerors, but found a country whose strength showed up not just in battle, but in the calm, relentless order of daily life. Decades later, some still remembered the shock of seeing industrial washing machines or professional barbers in action. Small details, but unforgettable all the same.